Hello, my name's Taylor Jansen, and today I'm recording my final four assessments in special education, and I will be discussing the least restrictive learning environment, the assessment process and four phases that go along with that, how to encourage family participation, and the three types of derived scores. First, I'm going to start by talking about the least restricted learning environment. This ensures that children with disabilities are offered as much opportunity as possible to be educated with children who are non-disabled. A child being placed in a special class that's separate from non-disabled students and separate from the general education room only occurs depending on the severity of this disability and if it cannot be accommodated for. Least restrictive learning environments relate to models of delivery in special education because teachers and educators must make every effort to include the student in the general education classroom. The IEP team must create proper accommodations and or modifications for the student so that they may be included with other students who are non-disabled. So these are created kind of on an individual basis because in reality no disability is the same. So for example, there is a student who requires the use of a resource room for a specific subject. He still studies the same materials or same curriculum, but it may be altered, or the special education room is used for the student who's unable to be in the general education room with an altered curriculum plan for a specific area that they are struggling with. Next, I'm going to be talking about excuse me, the assessment process and why it's described as a cycle. The special education assessment process is a systematic process and it reoccurs multiple times throughout the student's education. If the student is referred and receives special education services, then they are constantly monitored, and every 3 years they are reassessed by federal law to determine whether they are in need of special education services or not. If the student does not qualify for special education services, they are still monitored periodically through through informal assessment, and they can be re-referred for this assessment process to see if they do still qualify or not qualify for special education. So the different components of the assessment process, starting with phase 1, is identification and referral. This is just a general screening of the entire class. Typically, the teacher will notice students who struggle more than others. Often the referral and identification does come from the general education teacher, and they're really looking for students who are displaying problems in the major subject areas such as reading and mathematics. Referrals can also come from other sources such as the parents. They can request a referral if they think their student's really struggling in multiple areas. And so once the referral is identified, the student is given pre-referral intervention strategies. So if they see that the student is struggling, then they will go ahead and give them altered class interventions to try and help them in the subject and accommodations with instruction. So the referral is created typically by the general education teacher, and if the student is not, or if the parent is not already aware, then they will be notified that their student is in need of special education assessment to see if they are in need of special education programs such as an IEP. So this process heavily relies on the parental consent. They need to be notified and they have to sign a waiver saying their student or child can be assessed. The next phase is the determination of eligibility. During this phase, there is designing of the IAP or the Individualized Assessment Plan, and This individualized assessment is for the student in need of special education, and it's tailored to their specific possible need. So, for example, a student that has a physical disability, such as hearing or visual impairments, accommodations need to be put into place to make sure that the assessment is accurate to their learning disability and not to their physical disability, because that's what the teacher is really looking for. If it's not accommodated for, then the student would be incorrectly identified and not really be in need for special education services. During this phase, they also must receive written parental permission to continue with the assessment procedures, and they will administer, score, and then interpret the assessment and report the results to the team. And a formal decision will be made about eligibility for special education by the IAP team. This then pushes into phase 3, which is program planning. So it's determined that the student does indeed need special education. So they form an IEP team, which is an individualized education plan, and they're often the same members as the IAP, such as the parents, general educator, special educator, social workers, anyone else that was involved, but new additions may be included, such as a specialist, for example, if the student is in need of a speech therapist. So designing the IEP is a really important element to the student, and it's very important that the parent is involved in this so they understand what is going on, and the school must encourage it as much as possible and make every effort for the parent to be involved. Most government guidelines for creating the IEP include presenting levels of achievement for the student, establishing very clear goals and procedures of what the student needs to do to achieve them, and how they will measure the student's progress, and possibly even transition services for the student after high school as they get older. This can be added to the IEP later because they are reevaluated annually. So once the IEP is complete, then we once again must receive written parental permission that they are satisfied with how the IEP is written and all of the accommodations that will be made for their student. So that leads to phase 4, which is implementation and evaluation. During this step, they implement the IEP, and the student is now going to altered classes or whatever is needed for them. This is an ongoing process, like I said earlier, that the student is monitored and assessed to make sure that the interventions that are provided for the student are indeed making progress. So they're looking for the answer to the questions. Is this process working? Do we need to make adjustments? Does there need to be a reevaluation done? And this can be requested at any time if the child still appears to be struggling. So there is an annual review of the IEP, possibly twice a year, depending on the student's process. And then every 3 years, by federal law, it states that a student must be re-evaluated to see if they are still in need of special education services. So there are some strategies for parental involvement in the assessment process, and these are very simple things that teachers can do, but it's very important that we have parents involved to increase the success of special education. So the first one is to give them a voice, show value in the parents. They have a lot of valuable input about the child's behavior, both in and outside of school, and just to seek their knowledge, because this, again, is their child and they will know them best. Second is to set achievable but challenging goals. You don't want to set the goals too low, because then it doesn't really push the student to do better, but we don't want to set them too high because it can discourage them if they don't achieve them in a reasonable amount of time. Third is to avoid teacher talk, to use normal lingo that parents will understand and they'll be comfortable with during the conversation, chiming in and giving their input. Number 4 is to respect their cultural norms and values. I'm from such a small part of Kansas, we don't have a lot of diversity in that area, but I do realize, especially from this class, that Those are very important, and how you treat the parent about their child will give them strong feelings, positive or negative. And then the fifth one is to just keep them informed early on, as soon as this referral process begins and the assessment process is going on, just to do both positive and negative feedback and let them know what is happening with their child. So last, I'm going to talk about the 3 different types of derived scoring, which is percentile ranks, standard scores, and Stanines. Percentile ranks is a type of derived score that it indicates the percentage of an individual within a group or who has achieved a raw score or a lower one. So this is not comparable to an actual percentage. It's referring to a percentage of a test item. A raw score it corresponds to what the percentile rank is, meaning that a percentage of the norm group has earned the same raw score or less. So 5% of these students have earned this score. Usually the percentile score is separated by age levels, or typically it reads as years and months. For example, 6 years, 0 months. Excuse me. So now we are going to be talking back about standard scores. So standard scores are another form of derived score that is using the norm reference measure, and standard scores transform the raw score to a new scale using set, mean, and standard of deviation, or the amount in which a single score forms from a fixed value. So standard scores are used to measure performance of the same student on 2 different measures. They also provide a standard scale for reporting norms, and it goes by age and grade as well, the same as the percentile ranks. So it would be read as 6-0, 6 years or 0 months, and so forth. Stanines are distributed into 9 segments, hence the name, and it represents a range of performances rather than one specific score. So the student is ranging between one or the other, and because there's such a big variety of choice in these norm reference measures, they're very important in the selection process. So last, I'm going to talk a little bit about normal distribution. And normal distribution is the ability to determine the exact percentage of cases that fall within any portion of the curve. Standard scores are based on normal distribution, and it has special characteristics such as the student score is related to the mean and the standard deviation of the norm group. So those can be directly converted into the percentile ranks. Scoring is a little bit tough, and choosing the method of scoring is also very important when it comes to the assessment because of the variety that it offers. But that is my presentation, and I hope it was very informal, and thank you for listening.